Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Edge Investments, Who's Doing What and Why. We're really excited for this webinar today because we've got a great panel and hopefully a couple of somewhat interesting presentations from STL Partners. Before I go through the agenda of what we are going to be covering today, I just want to cover a few housekeeping notes. So, Chris, yep. So the first thing is, I guess hopefully everyone expects it to be this way, but everyone's on listen only mode, so we won't be able to hear you. If you do have any problems or if you do need to reach out to us, just type in a comment in the chat box. So there should be a little box that says chat. We are also going to be having quite a lengthy, I guess, Q&A session at the end where we'll get the panelists' views. So we do want to start getting those questions in. So please do put in your questions sort of ASAP, and that's in a separate box which says questions. The other thing is to note is that we will be sending all the slides and the recording of the webinar quite shortly in the next couple of days for everyone who has registered. So if you do need to drop off, that's okay. We will be sharing that. And we'll also be sharing sort of the Q&A answers written up as well. A couple of other things I just need to, I guess, point to is if you have any problems, there's also, where this arrow is pointing, number 2, there's this sort of like hand up icon. So if you have any problems, you can use that as well. And then the last thing is, if you are on social media, feel free to tweet us at STL Partners. And also, I guess just a sort of shout out to Broad Group, who have helped us to organize this webinar today. This is obviously part of Borderless Data Cloud, and there's a series of webinars happening for the rest of the day. So if you aren't aware of that, please do check that out on their website. So agenda for today, I've just kind of gone through the housekeeping. Next, we will hear from everyone and just introduce everyone who's presenting and a panelist on today's webinar. Then I'll be presenting a little bit of scene setting on the edge compute landscape. So I guess sharing a little bit of STL Partners' view on how we define edge, all the different types of edges, and what the value chain looks like. And that's going to be, I guess, key in driving some of the discussion that we will have around where investments are going across different types of edges and across the value chain. And then Chris will be presenting a little snapshot of what we are seeing as edge investments today and some of the, I guess, high profile sort of funding announcements and acquisitions that have happened in the last few years. And then we'll kind of move on to the panel discussion, which will be for about half an hour or so, and then wrap things up. So just quickly to introduce everyone, we have myself, Dalia Adib from STL Partners. So for those who don't know, STL Partners is a research and consulting firm based in London, and we do work globally. We mainly work in the telecom sector and sort of adjacent industries. And we have quite a big focus at the moment on edge computing. So we've been looking at edge computing for about 4 years now and advising various businesses on their sort of commercial strategy for edge compute mainly. And I myself head up the edge compute practice at STL, and I also lead some of our consulting projects. Then we've got Chris.
Chris Barraclough. I'm the founding partner at STL Partners, and I work both on the consulting side with Dalia and Phil Laidler, who heads up our consulting practice, and on the research side of the business, where Andrew Collinson heads up the piece. And I try and work across both of those, and have been in telecoms for about 25 years or so, and before that was an investment banker or an equity analyst with JP Morgan.
My name is Eli Scher. I am currently the vice chairman of OpenIX, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to the proliferation of intranet exchange points. I'm also the founder of New Continuum Datacentres and UnitedIX, a Metro Edge, a Chicago Metro Edge infrastructure platform that we sold last summer to SBA Communications, the wireless tower REIT, and I continue to consult SBA.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Kochan, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of US Ignite, which is a research nonprofit and public-private partnership based in Washington, D.C. I've been in the telecom industry for more than 15 years now as an entrepreneur and operator. And our current, one of the current programs we run at US Ignite is a $100 million Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research partnership, where we are working to build 4 at-scale test beds for 5G networks and beyond. And obviously, those test beds include quite a number of opportunities for edge compute, which is an important part of the future of network architecture. So glad to be with you this morning.
And good morning, John Mauck. I am a partner in Digital Colony. We are an investment vehicle, a fund with over 20 billion of assets under management. And we are focused solely on communication infrastructure as an ecosystem and as a theme. So that's towers, fiber, small cell, and data centers, both on the edge and the core of the hyperscale focus. And so again, this is a sector we're spending a lot of time around because it's the touch points, a lot of those. So we'll talk more about it, but thank you for having me this morning or this afternoon.
Thanks, guys. Thanks very much. So we will be coming back to Joe, John, and Eli kind of hopefully in the second half of the webinar and hearing their views on some of these key questions. So before we get started, we just have a poll to sort of get your views a little bit and just understand who we have today on the webinar. So we just wanted to, I guess, get an understanding of where your organization is in terms of exploring edge computing, because there's quite a range. It's all relatively early stage, but some organizations are starting to create sort of commercial strategies, develop their portfolio, their products, make investments, and we just kind of want to get a feel of where people are at. So hopefully you should see the poll options in a moment. So the poll options, the answers are going to be if you're at a very early stage of building an understanding of edge computing, whether you're just formulating a strategy for edge computing, maybe you're a bit more advanced and you're sort of planning to make some relatively significant investments in edge computing, or you've already made some investments in edge.
John, can you pop those for us? No, I think we may need to come back to those or
There we go. We're good, we're good.
Okay, we're good.
Okay, so just to restate, so we're asking everyone where your organization is at in terms of exploring edge. So whether it's an early stage, building an understanding, formulating a strategy, planning to make investments, already making some investments in edge. Just wait a couple of minutes. So it's quite interesting, already seeing a pretty big spread of respondents coming in. And I suppose that's not surprising. We have, I guess, probably reached out to a community who's a bit self-selecting, quite interested in edge anyway. And so I'd expect a lot of our audience today is at least exploring edge computing and probably a little bit more advanced. So if we can we flash the results up? Great. So yeah, I guess as you can see here, we've got pretty much an even-ish spread across most of the responses, except I guess planning to make investments. So I suppose more than half are at this sort of early-ish stage of understanding edge, formulating a strategy, and then we have some around, I guess a quarter of the audience who are making investments, and then there's a few who are sort of in that middle stage. So there's a bit of a gap. There's almost a polarization of those who are ready to go investing in edge and those who are still early. And so I think when we have our next poll, which is a little bit about where investments are happening, we'll be interested to hear the views of those who are already making investments in edge. Okay, so if we go back to the presentation. So I suppose the first thing I'm going to be presenting on, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just lay sort of this scene setting and laying the land of where things are at. And I guess, I'm sure most of the audience who is on the webinar today sort of understands edge to some degree and the benefits, but we kind of like to think of edge as somewhere along this spectrum between hyperscale data centers and the internet, and then sort of the end devices and the end users. And there's almost like two ways of looking at the benefits of edge. One, which is kind of thinking about why would some applications or use cases that currently reside in a remote data center want to move closer to the end user or to the source of the data. And that's usually because of low latency, which is always kind of synonymous with edge. Everyone talks about whether it's 5 millisecond, 10 millisecond latency, these latency requirements that maybe future applications need. The other thing that's becoming increasingly difficult, I guess, with the move towards IoT and the proliferation of data is the cost of moving and transporting that data across the network. And when you have all that raw data coming through, it's really expensive, not just to compute that at a central location, but also to transport all that data to a sort of remote data center. The other thing that again also is becoming increasingly a bit of a challenge for especially enterprises is managing data privacy and data security, and that can sometimes be at the end user level, where you have laws like GDPR dictating how enterprises and companies need to manage their data for their end users, but then also sort of corporate security and corporate IP and cyber security, all that needs to be sometimes managed in a more distributed way to protect the enterprise too. On the other hand, you sort of have, I guess, applications and workloads that have maybe come from a more sort of traditional on-premises or on-device world. So, you know, you have, say, some IoT applications which just some are fully autonomous, but it's running on the end device. And that can be sort of inflexible. And so the benefits of moving to a more kind of cloud-like infrastructure, the first thing is reducing the cost and the size, sort of the footprint of that infrastructure on premises, where if you have dedicated boxes for each different application, that can be sort of unwieldy and also not optimal in certain environments, say in like retail, where they have sort of expensive real estate that they don't want to be taken up by lots of servers and things like that. The other thing is improving application mobility. And so, you know, if you have something that's on flexible infrastructure, that application can move as the end user moves or as the source of data moves, and it can enhance accessibility to the application. I've kind of mentioned flexibility, but you know, one of the challenges, I guess, with sort of monolithic or on-premise or on-device compute is that it's very fixed. And it's not easy for the application developer to scale that application for different users or to scale it across sort of geographic boundaries, or even be able to, you know, swap applications in and out. And that's been, I guess, partly one of the challenges, say, in industry like manufacturing or the industrials have faced, is that they have built their, say, compute infrastructure on very proprietary systems. And so moving towards sort of more edge, more flexible systems and architecture can help overcome those problems. And then the other thing that gets brought up a lot is, and kind of related to the point I just mentioned, is vendor lock-in as well. So if you can leverage open architectures, open infrastructure, you're less likely to be locked in by a vendor, at least at an infrastructure level. That can still happen, obviously, you know, higher up the value chain. So that's a little bit about the benefits. Then, you know, the where is edge question kind of gets brought in, and, you know, we'll explore that in a bit more detail when we talk about investments. But if we think about hyperscale cloud sort of being at the internet side, if we think about sort of the spectrum of all possible compute locations, pretty much the rest is edge compute. And I guess we as STL Partners don't tend to include, say, the end device as an edge compute location, but there are companies that will, especially device manufacturers. They want to be able to make those devices smarter, use virtualized platforms on those devices, implement containers, so that, say, like a camera can actually run different applications or can upgrade applications on that camera device readily. And, you know, I guess also companies like ARM, for example, are, you know, developing a lot of IP and a lot of capabilities to allow that. But between the device and, say, the hyperscale, you have this, broadly speaking, I guess, three types of edge. We have the regional edge, and you'll see when Chris discusses things, a lot of activities happening at the regional edge. And these are about distributing the internet exchanges, creating more points of interconnect between telecoms operators, and also sort of co-locating the content providers at those locations as well, so that you can reduce latency and increase the performance of certain applications. And that will be kind of, I guess, probably a little bit country dependent, the need for those regional edges, because in a country, say, like the US, and the way that the telecoms network is architected there's more of a need for these regional edges. Then you have sort of the telecoms operators locations, which are network edge, or sometimes in the industry we call it multi-access edge computing, and that can span from sort of telco data centers in the core network all the way through to the access network, where you have the tower edge, as we like to call it. And then you have the sort of customer sites, which is the on-premise edge, where we kind of like to look at it as the access point. which directly connects with a wide area network. So these are things like maybe an IoT gateway or a customer premise equipment. And then you have sort of the general maybe enterprise location, which could be a sort of on-prem data center or a rack or a sort of a small edge in a box type device, which will need to connect to something else to connect to a network. And this just sort of shows, where companies are at, where you have, the hyperscale cloud guys, companies like Equinix, the cloud providers, that's, where they come from. Regional edge, we're seeing more and more activity there from companies like Compass and Digital Realty. Network edge, I mean, we've only got Deutsche Telekom and AT&T, but obviously there's a whole long list of telecoms operators who sort of control and are part of this domain. But then we also are seeing, say, edge data center companies like Vapor and Edge Micro developing some of the facilities for that domain. And then, and then we've got the on-prem and the device edge too, where we've just pointed out Schneider Electric, for example, is a company who's investing heavily in, say, the on-prem edge. And I guess the one thing to know, and I don't want to take too much time up, but there's something that's really creating a lot of interest in edge computing is what the hyperscalers are doing, and they are already the strongest players, say, in hyperscale based public cloud services. They are moving towards the edge more and more. So I guess initially a lot of it was around their IoT offerings with Azure, with sort of Azure's IoT Hub, and AWS with Greengrass and their IoT capabilities as well. That was a little bit more on allowing maybe less connected enterprises who want to implement IoT to access those applications by running them on premise. And since then, in the last year or so, they've expanded, I guess, their offerings across the edge, where they're partnering with the telecoms operators in the network edge with things like AWS Wavelength or Azure Edge Zones. They're doing more at the regional edge level with, for example, with AWS and local zones, and they are continuously going to be obviously moving towards the edge and starting to commercially launch those offerings that they announced kind of at the beginning of this year and the end of last year. And the other thing is, they are not, though, the only ones in the value chain. And I guess it's the thing with edge right now is it's a bit of a land grab, or there's huge fragmentation in terms of the ecosystem. There are established companies who are trying to move into the edge, and then you have startups who are developing sort of new capabilities that will help to ultimately bring edge to end customers and build edge solutions. And this is, I guess, a little bit of how we sometimes like to talk about the value chain, where you have sort of the facility level, which is more about the real estate, the data centers themselves and some of the services around that. Then you have the network, and you have specific capabilities which are important for edge, whether it's about content delivery or even these edge gateways, which allow some level of traffic to break out at the edge sites. Hardware, cloud infrastructure, where there are lots of companies playing a part already, and then you have new companies who are bringing sort of edge cloud platforms, multi-cloud platforms to enable this edge ecosystem, and then it's sort of the applications and the systems integration on top of that. I think here on the next slide, this is just a snapshot, if I can go back to it, of companies who are creating those capabilities, who are moving into the space, and most of these companies will have offerings that span across the value chain, and it will be I guess what's happening is that whereas we had sort of defined roles or defined places in the value chain where some of these companies sit, things are kind of, companies like the hyperscalers are moving into the edge or moving into, say, hardware, which they weren't playing a role in before. And then you have some of the software companies maybe moving into devices or hardware or networking. So it's sort of, as I said, all up for grabs. And I guess what we want to discuss in this webinar today is who are making investments and where are these investments being made in the value chain. That's me. I will hand over to Chris now.
Thanks, Dalia. So Dalia sort of teed up the landscape, and I guess before I hand over to my illustrious panel, I'm going to try and put a few facts around what we've seen so far, probably over the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of capital moving towards the edge, what that looks like and who the players are involved and why it's happening, and then tee up, I think, the conundrum probably for the next 10 years in terms of when capital is going to flow and where it's going to flow. So if we kind of look at the situation now, we're kind of seeing 4 main pools of capital flowing increasingly outwards towards the end user. And if you think, Dalia mentioned the public cloud provider, the hyperscalers, particularly Google, AWS, and Azure, they are obviously investing huge amounts in cloud compute, and I'll show that in a minute. And some of that, both in terms of capital, but also in terms of OPEX and activity and partnerships, as well as M&A, in the case of Microsoft in particular, is demonstrating a move towards the edge quite clearly. There are a whole host of other technology companies, we've mentioned IBM, HPE here, but a whole raft of others who are also investing either in systems integration, applications, or cloud infrastructure. The telecoms operators who run those networks and are themselves virtualizing their own networks and looking to deploy compute rather than being specialist routers and servers and so on for telco equipment, they're now moving much more to off the shelf as they virtualize their networks. They have spotted that there is an opportunity not only to do that for their own functions, but also for third parties. And then the area we're going to look at in terms of being able to look at more specifically the capital flowing into the edge is the kind of venture capitals, private equity, and other infrastructure funds and so on. And we'll look at the monies there. There is clearly other capital flowing from these other companies and these other sort of quadrants that are more difficult to directly follow, but actually clearly an important part of the situation here. So just to put in context the relative size of capital that we've plotted, the telecoms industry generates about 2 trillion in revenue, and it varies year to year, but across fixed and mobile, invests around 350 billion in capital. A lot of that in the radio access network, but all across the network, OSS and BSS, pretty large. The 3 big hyperscalers in 2019 invested around 54 billion in their cloud, principally in cloud compute, and obviously some of that is flowing towards the edge, but a lot of that remains in their hyperscale activities. And then from what we have been able to pick up, just to put it in context, over a 4-year period, and the other 2 are annual, so this is over a 4-year period from 2016 to 2020. It's not exhaustive, but it gives you an order of magnitude of the kind of level of investments that we have managed to track and sort of trace going into edge computing. Comes in at about 2 billion. So we're still very early in terms of what we are seeing in terms of the capital markets attracting funding from the capital markets into edge computing, despite it being quite an area that is considered to be quite highly hyped, I suppose. So if we dig down into that 2 billion and look at the areas that Dalia outlined across that value chain with the facility working upwards, we can see that over half of that we believe is going into facilities, and that's companies, as Dalia mentioned, Vapor, Compass, Edge Micro, EdgePoint Systems. And then cloud infrastructure is the other major sort of sector. Docker, D2IQ, Litmus, and so on are picking up investments. And then the third sort of bucket, applications and software, C3AI, Crosser, Golem, Iguazia, and so on, have picked up funding. Now, this is sort of fresh capital as opposed to M&A. We've seen quite a lot of acquisition, particularly in the facilities area. Recently, I think just yesterday, Bell Canada, Equinix, I think, announced the acquisition of 13 data centers in Bell Canada, and other large investment M&A. We haven't counted that as fresh new capital coming into the, but we do recognize and we do track in the ecosystem. All this is kind of built off a spreadsheet that we've been tracking and using in terms of a tool for tracking investments and what's happening in the sort of edge ecosystem. If we drill down a little bit more into those facilities and where they are, Dalia outlined the kind of regional, then the network, and then the kind of tower this is not in order, we should be moving from left to right or right to left. You can see that the first stage in terms of moving from the center and the hyperscale is to the region. We picked up about a billion of facilities that are being invested in at the regions. A lot of that is being driven, at least in part, by the hyperscalers themselves. So, and some of those regional data centers are pretty big, and you could argue, well, actually, they're really hyperscale. And certainly a lot of them, I think, are at least securing anchor tenants in the form of the hyperscalers, and then looking for additional sales of facilities and compute to enterprises. And then if you go further on down into the network and to the tower with Vapor and so on, it's much smaller. From what we can see, much smaller. So at the moment, the big monies have clearly been going into hyperscale cloud compute. It's moving down towards the regional, and it's still very early days in terms of the network and the tower, and that is often quite small funding for, you know, Series A kind of funding levels for startups, particularly at that level. So just turning briefly to this notion of latency and why latency is important, and this is a bit of a sort of telco view of the world, but I thought it would be interesting. It's slightly old data, it's about 18 months, but I think what this shows, and we've got Italy and the UK, and it's the 4 operators in each of those markets, and we've got the percentage of transactions or data flowing backwards and forwards from handsets through across the various hops that they need to get to and back to the handset, and we've tracked the latency that has been experienced by the application on the handset. And it shows the distribution in terms of the proportion of those transactions. So if you look at the median level for example, Vodafone in Italy, it's a 40 milliseconds. And you know, that's an important number, but the way latency operates, if you're building up a web page or you're conducting a series of transactions, you have lots of microservices pinging backwards and forwards, and it's not your fastest medium for any particular transaction or ping. It's also your average is important, because if you have hundreds and hundreds of pieces of information going backwards and forwards, it can only be one of those that has high latency, a real lag on it, that causes you problems with your application. And what we found is, therefore, if you look at Italy compared to the UK, the difference between the median and the average is much wider. In other words, the operators there have less consistent latency in Italy than they did in the UK. The average and the median much closer in the UK. The other thing that we kind of found is that once round trip latency goes above 100%, then it led to a much greater increase in application error rate. And again, if you look particularly with Wind and Iliad, with nearly 9%, nearly 13% of transactions actually being above 100 milliseconds, it's a major problem. So what does edge compute do? Well, at the first level, it potentially enables you to push everything down to the left-hand side, to move your curves more towards the left-hand side. With 5G, clearly also you have an opportunity with network slicing combined with edge compute to be able to offer consumers, but also enterprise businesses, guarantees about the experience they will have on a particular network slice by being able to place compute at the appropriate point in the network or on the premises or at the regional, in order to be able to provide them with the capabilities they require for their particular applications. So telcos themselves are, 5 years ago when we kind of initially did this activity of looking at latency, everybody in the telco industry went, certainly, you know, not on the technical side, on the commercial side. It's increasingly come front of mind, I think, and people are more aware on the enterprise side in customers and within the operator of the competitive advantage of being able to provide a flexible, reactive network. And that's where edge compute really comes in. And coming back to Dalia's sort of framework around how we define edge and kind of move them from across the top down the side. You've got at the top, the hyperscale. And I've tried to put in here, what kind of data center you're seeing, where you might find it, a kind of order of magnitude of the numbers you'll get per 10 million of population, and a ballpark latency. This is imperfect, it's simplified, and I'm sure somebody who's technical would say I've massively oversimplified this. Trying to give you an indication of, as you move to the regional level, you're kind of going up perhaps by 100-fold almost in terms of the numbers of data centers you might have, and you are reducing the latency. And as you go out, we typically find, as you get closer to the customer, the volume of data centers down at the tower or the micro, and the tower is very mobile, but micro or tower, you're talking about thousands of potential data centers there per 10 million of population in order to be able to give latency of 10 milliseconds or so. And so what you can see is the customer experience clearly improves as you reach the edge, but also the capital cost goes up dramatically. And I guess from an investment perspective, and I'm teeing this up, but the lads are going to be able to solve this for you and answer that with no problem, is the challenge for an investor is, where do you invest and at what point do you deploy capital within this range in order to be able to get a return on your investment. And that's about finding the correct use cases and getting a return on your investment. And there's always a catch-22 here. The use cases don't develop until the capital's there and the infrastructure's there. And of course, the infrastructure, we're reluctant to deploy capital until there are very clear use cases. And I guess the big question, I think, over the next 2, 3, 4 years is, when does capital flow from the top downwards? And when do we think that will happen? And who will be involved in making that happen? Is it going to be private companies, or is it going to involve some kind of consortium? Is it going to involve a government and so on? So I'm kind of teeing that up. And then what I'd like to do, just before we kick off the discussion, which I think is going to focus probably on the next 18 months to 3 years, is to get your perspective on the big picture. And it has oft been said that edge compute is going to be a huge source of investment over the next 10 or more years. And I guess my question for you is, where do you think most capital, and I would include with that both the external funding that we've tried to track here and the company funding from the hyperscalers, from the telcos, and from other technology companies, where will they flow? Where will most of that flow over the next 10-year period? So looking beyond the immediate. And if we can pop that poll up, I can't actually see the answers on my screen because I've got the presentation up here. So Dalia, if you can walk, when that pops up, if you could walk people through the answers from the regional data center down, hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory: regional, network, tower or micro. We recognize that it's not just the mobile, and then the on-prem data. So I think those are the options we've got. I can't actually see them, but hopefully I've read them out correctly.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. So I guess with on-prem data centers here, we mean other on-prem infrastructure as well. And I know we've already had a question on that. So it'll be interesting to see people's thoughts on, say, traditional data centers and also investment into this on-premise customer site edge, which we haven't seen so much of yet.
Right. How are we doing on that?
So yeah, I think we've got around 40% of people voted. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, what this shows is actually that there is still going to be a lot of most investment, even the next 10 years, at the regional data center space. But interestingly, a lot happening at the tower and micro data center level. I guess, again, like, not too surprising, because we are seeing a bit of that already today, even though, it's a fairly deep in the network level of edge computing. I guess we've seen a bit less on network data centers, and in some ways, those those facilities at least exist today, right? Because the telecoms operators have those facilities today, but there does need to be some investment in essentially converting those into, say, some level of a kind of tier 3, tier 4 data center, and evolving those so that they can become edge compute locations, not just premises for housing the telecoms network infrastructure. And then, yeah, again, like on-prem data center, a little bit less. So maybe if kind of on that note, we can sort of kick off the panel discussion. So I don't know if we can sort of close, yeah, and then stop presenting and have us all join in. So thanks, Eli, John, and Joe, for being a little bit quiet the last 20 minutes or so. But we really want to hear from you now. And I guess, I mean, maybe the first thing is, and I'll start with John first, just almost to comment on those results of the poll and to what extent they match your expectations of where you see investments going in the next 10 years.
Sure. No, thank you. And as an investor, right, that's exactly what I'm thinking about, which is, you know, not necessarily the technology, but where does the capital go in to sort of make money on that? And so maybe to step back a little bit, you know, very long term, we think there is a cycle here, right? It went from mainframes to desktop computers, then back to the concentrated cloud, and now to sort of distributed cloud. And so that cycle makes sense. And so we think there's a fundamental thesis around that. The catalyst are some of the things that were mentioned, right? Internet of Things, 5G, and the adoption there, which we think really drives investment and the opportunity here. It's unclear what the killer app is in our mind. You know, we think there's lots of use cases, but what is it that at the end is going to drive the economic demand? And so when I think about, you know, where the capital goes for the edge, the question that we're tracking is, what is the use case that makes it, you know, economically efficient? It improves performance, right? It drives down latency, and all those players that you were talking to, the ones we know today and the ones that will emerge as new applications and platforms develop, they're trying to win customers, win eyeballs, you know, aggregate data. And so, you know, that will become, I think, some application that or some version that will be the real driver of adoption. We think about what that means for where we are today, right? You know, what's interesting about COVID, and we look back on this, not to go on a tangent here, but we're going to look back on this. And one of the things coming out of this is that this has been just a step function of demand and validation of data centers, the importance of the digital ecosystem, right? This next wave of industrialization around it. And what we're seeing around it today and how we support that is that regional location you mentioned in your survey. And what the edge is depends, in our view, somewhat on what the application is. And so where do companies need to get to today to improve performance and make that be a positive economic trade-off? If you're doing everything in Ashburn, Virginia, and you push things to Pittsburgh, right, that may be a regional data center in the way the survey was done, but that may be a widely improved performance location for customers in that market and go to market. If you're thinking internationally, right, that could be going to Brazil versus Texas, I mean, or Mexico City. And so, you know, the edge is somewhat defined with a market and use case around that. So as we think about that, I wasn't surprised by that sort of the importance of that in the survey. I think as it keeps going closer, you're going to see some trade-offs around that, right? What is it? What do you need to go closer to the network edge or to the premises? What's the infrastructure around that? And what's the trade-off of latency and performance if you can do something with a CRAN architecture or some other co-located environment? At a very broad level, we think all of these things, by the way, are a massive incentive for co-locating that space. When you look back, Chris, at the money you were pointing to and where the dollars are spent, $1 billion of that, you know, $2 billion was around facilities. Well, arguably, that's the one thing that isn't the special sauce for Google, Amazon, Microsoft. That's what they need to outsource. And if you think about trying to create a co-located environment, that makes a lot of sense for all of them. There's economies of scale around that. And that same thing with the CRAN architecture supporting the tower distribution, or even on the 5G, depending on the spectrum, it requires a lot of additional towers being built, right? So that means more CapEx per unit of compute or per location. And so again, another catalyst for co-locating on towers, co-locating on fiber to a CRAN, co-locating to a co-location data center that's a regional or even someplace closer. So we think all of these things are broadly positive for investing in infrastructure, which is where I spend my time. But I think the timing of that is going to be somewhat driven by the use cases, the adoption of the Internet of Things, new applications coming online. But we do think those continue to move forward as there continues to be progress around that. So although today, if I had the if I had the answer on the killer app, I would be currently dropping off this call and investing in it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, you raised quite a few of our discussion points, but maybe taking the first one around use cases. I just wanted to get maybe Eli your perspective on use cases, because I guess you've been an entrepreneur, say in the metro edge space, right? And you're doing, I think, stuff even deeper edges. What are you seeing as some of the key use cases which maybe are driving regional edge now, but how will those use cases change to drive, say, the tower edge or the network edge or even the on-premise edge? How are they different?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to look at the CDNs here and recognize that they've created the edge and created distributed architecture long ago, and that's includes some of the hyperscalers, right? So their CDNs already live all over and can create efficient routes to deliver traffic, right? And so that's what we've seen over I guess you call it this COVID period, with the sort of meteoric rise of internet traffic, and the ability to make it work has really largely been on the fiber line network, right? It really hasn't stressed the mobile network because people have been at home on Wi-Fi, right? Which is a really interesting thing to look at. So, arguably it hasn't been great for, 5G investment and 5G adoption, right? But it has been great for pushing that compute out closer to the end user to make that experience better, right? And so undoubtedly where that's happening is the metro edge, right? It's clear from your survey, it's clear from your assessment of the landscape of where capital is going. It's going to where the workloads are going, which is the metro edge, right? And so my view is eventually it goes out farther. And so, why does it do that, and when exactly? We certainly think from the ground up it happens because it's required. And so there are use cases out there, whether they're some sort of smart warehouse with lots of automation, or some sort of experience. I guess people aren't going to the mall anymore, but like these truly immersive experiential experiences at the mall, or oil and gas. I mean, what an incredible use case that will be again, right? I mean, there's a lot going on in that sector. But all over, you're seeing where it does make sense in specific locations, right? And so, my view is that the investments start now, and they are starting, right? People are making investments in building out that infrastructure because it makes sense for them. And really, a lot of that is driven by private networks and people building private networks with the access to, shared spectrum and some of these sort of larger trends that are making this technology available. I believe it's happening now, and really the time to be sort of staking the ground, if you will, is now, and building out and sort of putting those resources to work where they can make money today, and then you can ideally multi-tenant them later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I get, so you mentioned some of these use cases, like more on the enterprise side, say smart warehousing, for example. We actually had we have a couple of questions actually looking at different applications. So one I wanted to bring up, and maybe good to get your views, Joe, because there's a little bit of a 5G angle here, which is, so Jason said, why are you focused on Datacentres as a source of edge processing for telecoms? On-premises disaggregated services over 5G will lead this, surely. It's on-premise where the use cases are already, ? So I guess, the question is isn't that where there's a lot of investment as well? And I suppose looking at it from a data center perspective, you don't see that. But I just wanted to get your views on the on-premises side and on the enterprise maybe use cases. What are those use cases, and what are some of the investments maybe being made there?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think there's an interesting way to bring together some of John's comments and Eli's comments in the previous questions to answer this one, which is that I'm not entirely certain there is one particular killer app that answers this question for everything, but there is a movement in terms of disaggregating network functions so as to make 5G deployment faster and better. And as that's happening, as you're breaking apart components, you are by definition putting compute closer to people in networks. That's what part of this result is, and it's not necessarily because of one thing or another. But if you imagine putting more compute closer to people so as to facilitate or speed a 5G deployment, whether that's just in terms of the network operator doing so to make their own network easier, or as Eli mentioned, in the case of enterprise grade or some slightly larger than enterprise private network deployment, you are effectively putting more compute and storage closer to people to make the network go faster. Forget about any of the rest of it, to achieve some of those latency results that Chris talked about in his presentation. Well, as you do that, the marginal cost of adding capacity to that compute and storage and increasing your mobile edge computing opportunities is low, right? It doesn't cost you that much more to take a device that was going to help make the network faster and disaggregate some network function and double or triple its capacity and virtualize, slice off, and use that capacity for something else. Whether that's going to be necessarily for customer end storage, on-premise, et cetera. Sure, that's one option. But start thinking more about some of the bigger, broader, they're not immediate use cases, John, but they are coming soon. The facility automation, the transportation automation, the delivery vehicles, the autonomous vehicles, the things that we know people want that maybe are a little further away than we imagine, but the things that we know people want are coming. All of those are going to require not only very low latency, high response networks, but they're going to require a ton of edge processing of video data, a ton of edge processing of sensor data. And if you have built a flexible, disaggregated, more virtualized 5G network to get that capacity there, also having some of that, the pieces of the network that do that processing for the network, do some processing for the application, and thereby reducing your backhaul network traffic, reducing the need to go to a regional or a hyperscale data center, you start to see the confluence of the use case and the network design and the benefits that Chris talked about of edge compute all sort of come together into one package, and that really starts the flywheel going on deploying more mobile edge compute.
Sure. And I guess like all these things, compute, I'll come back to you, Chris, promise. All these things around compute and connectivity clearly are, well, we think are going to benefit, right? But what's the demand side view of that? And we have a couple of questions on that, just to expand on this whole enterprise use case. So there's one question from Bob, which is saying, but how critical is edge computing to enterprise digital transformation? So where does it fit into what they are trying to achieve? Where maybe 5G and slicing is something that they've never heard of or they're not looking at right now. And the other question from Kennedy is also kind of similar, but which use cases are enterprises most focused on right now? And do they deliver compelling ROI by executing at the edge? So I don't know, maybe Chris, I know we've been working a little bit on this, but just to hear your views.
Yeah, I mean, I think they often do go hand in hand, edge compute and 5G, but often they find it almost easier to understand the edge computing aspect. And we found that rather like 5G, manufacturing and the use of managing workloads close to the endpoint is where you've got a lot of capital already deployed. You need to manage your data. You have your IT and OT converging, and you want to get quick response and agile response for your OT, is starting to attract a lot of interest around edge computing. Other heavy industries, you clearly got things like mining and oil and gas that was mentioned, where connectivity itself is either unavailable or difficult to get or very expensive. And the problems of shutting down an oil well or a mining site is huge if you've got a rock that's too big to go in your crusher. You're slowing down an end-to-end process industry. So the notion, which costs you millions really, really quickly. So very quickly, the value of getting compute out to the edge so that you keep that huge capital investment working and being squeezed has very high value. And I think, it's fairly clear that the ability for private capital in particular, whether it be from the enterprise or from third parties or from corporations, is flowing particularly at the moment into these specific B2B use cases. Because if you think about the consumer, the requirement to have either a national player like a telco or a government involved to provide equal service across all your end users because of the universal service obligations, it would be very difficult to justify too much regional activity. Whereas on the B2B side, you can do that, and you can either be funded from multiple sources. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that.
I might just add, as we think about part of the adoption here, right? The Internet of Things or device-based platforms are really much more sensitive to latency delays, right? They're much more impacted by the drag or poor performance. I think as individuals, that's there's actually a different sort of expectation or standard. But for that equipment you're talking about that can autonomously re-engage, right? That can be meaningful, and you can really address that. So we think that's probably part of the catalyst there is the adoption of the Internet of Things, which tends to be very closely tied to this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, the person before it said, does it start on-prem, right? And I think the answer is yes, right? It does start on-prem. But what's important to recognize is you can do all you want on-prem. If it can't interconnect back at a regional data center, you haven't done anything, right? You can do all you want and then just send all that data all the way back to Ashburn or wherever it needs to go, right? So, the key is really having compute all along the way. And so it's coming out from the core and coming from the edge in, right? And so the key is use case by use case, right? So the CDNs are pushing it out from the core, I think, right? And enterprises and private networks and some of these other really interesting use cases are oil and gas, right? Are building it from the edge in. But if they don't have somewhere to interconnect, it doesn't work, right? So really it's, it's a comprehensive thing that all constituents need to participate in, right? It's not one killer app or one, company that's going to lead the way. And the sooner, honestly, that the ecosystem is more open and, people are sharing more, the faster this is going to take off, right? And I mean, that's my view. But I do think that open architecture will spur innovation.
I think it's interesting because for a long time, we're at a transition point a little bit, especially when you talk about consumers. I think businesses and others have been a little more aware of this sort of thing. But for a long time, people defined the quality of their network connection with one answer, with speed, right? I have good internet at my house because it's fast. My phone is good because it's 4G. Now we're starting to unpack the layers of what you're able to do because that matters for the applications people care about, right? The next wave of applications that come are going to be ones that automate or systematize our physical world and the world around us. And those sorts of applications don't just need a whole bunch of bandwidth on a bursty best efforts basis, right? They may need persistent, connections at very low latency that are incredibly reliable. And that is an entirely different network architecture that delivers that quality of a connection. And in many cases, that architecture needs never to be trying to get back to Ashburn, Virginia for critical information, right? Your autonomous vehicle better not be trying to get from wherever you are always back to Ashburn, or you have a problem. It may need some things from a remote data center, but it can't constantly be that same architecture where, right, once I punch the button to get my Netflix movie and it starts buffering and I'm a minute ahead, I'm fine. And I got the next 2 hours and I'm set and I'm never going to think about my network connection again. You're talking much more about applications and use cases. And I think somebody made a good point earlier that in many cases, the B2B, the commercial or enterprise grade requirements are going to drive this because they're already beginning this automation process and they are starting to realize, hey, I cannot just cloud my way out of this answer. I can't just say it's going to be in the cloud. It's got to be, I've got to invest in some network infrastructure here. Wi-Fi isn't good enough. Best efforts isn't good enough. We need to think a little bit more and be a little smarter. I just spent the last 5 or 8 years dumping everything in my enterprise into the cloud because that made sense. Well, that only makes sense for some things. Now I actually have to start bringing some of that back. And this goes to that sort of cycle or that pendulum that John started the conversation off with, right? You mainframe and then you desktop. And then you cloud, and now you're going to mobile edge, and it's going to go back and forth and back and forth. And it's the story of telecom, right? That's the story of how network improves. And we're very much, I think, in this cycle of coming back toward more distributed, smaller scale, faster, lower latency. And I think almost all the applications we're talking about are going to need that one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess so. We talked a lot about sort of like this internet exchange and the need to interconnect deeper. So, I mean, Neil asked, does IP internet peering need to change as often this is pretty centralized for network operators today? And I think we've kind of already said yes, but I guess the question is, how will that change? So who needs to be involved, and what will change maybe from an ecosystem perspective to allow that to happen, or from an investment perspective to allow that to happen? Kind of open question, don't know.
And follow the question exactly. Well, can you rephrase? I'm sorry.
If we do, so we're saying we do need the internet exchange or the IP internet pairing to change. The system needs to change.
Yes.
But I'm asking, so the question from Neil was, does it need to change? And I think we've already established that it does.
Right.
But it's kind of how will that change is the question.
So right, I think, Dalia, you alluded to this early on, which is in the U.S. it's very different, right? You sort of have distributed exchange architecture in the UK and across Europe. You have peering points all over a metro with hundreds of peers at each location, right? And so in the US, we typically don't have that, and it's not nearly as distributed or available. So, so look, the internet is working great now, right? But what's in place? So the question is, for the next layer of things, is it going to be okay to interconnect only in these few places? And I think we must say the answer is no, because the round trips are too long, and you're paying exorbitant bandwidth costs. I mean, that's already happening, right? The push to more regional exchange points is already happening, and it's driven by major CDNs. We don't need to name them, but they're already doing it, right? And so the key is, from my perspective, is that edge can't really grow unless those exchange points are already out there, so that there is something for these endpoints, right, at the enterprise level or wherever, to interconnect back with on a low latency basis. So, does that answer it?
I mean, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think there's always a double-edged sword here for every party. You're a telco, and you see a competitive differentiation for keeping people on your network, and your network showing a superior experience to another network. Or you're an AWS, and you have a desire to keep your enterprise customers on AWS from cloud compute right the way to on-prem with Outposts, whatever it happens to be. So yeah, the theory of having everybody with an open architecture, I think we all go, I kind of get that. And yet you can see that there is always, for every individual player, a desire at the same point to kind of not interconnect when you want to keep your customer, and yet to have interconnect on somebody else's customer. And I think that is always this tension that slows things down.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
So to be honest, we're kind of coming up to time. We actually have quite a few other questions, a little bit more on kind of investment in on-prem edge, a few others on role of Wi-Fi in this, even things like shared models, say for device edge and autonomous cars. That's a lot of compute happening. How will they share that? So I think what we're going to do is we'll kind of download all the questions and answer all of those individually and document those and be able to share that with everyone who registered for the webinar today. I guess before we wrap up, I don't know if anyone wanted to sort of give any last notes of what's to come from an investment perspective, or what to watch out for that will signal maybe the start of this change and more investments at the edge.
I might just say that we think this is sort of a question of when, not if. And so fundamentally, I think we're bullish on this. And the driver of what will be the when we think about investing, we're really tracking what the end customers are doing, what the large customers are doing. We're looking at the activities of the customers that pay. From our standpoint, sometimes there's great ideas, but we want to see how those get monetized. And I think we're at a point now where we see the fundamental need, we understand the rationale and the theory, and the question is, how does that evolve the capital deployed and dollars of profit being generated? So again, I think that's what I would say is an overarching comment at the end.
Yeah, I guess
anyone else?
Well, I would say that, and I think, you know, you always start with the customer. It makes very good sense. But the other players I would look out for are what the hyperscalers are doing. Because if you look at the regional data center, they've actually been responsible for a lot of the capacity in the regional data centers. A lot of the investment has been contingent upon them taking 30, 40, 50% of a regional data center, and then the rest is topped up with, you know, much more profitable. And I think what we are starting to see is them doing deals with telcos and shifting out towards the you know, further out in the edge. We're seeing them look at becoming, you know, telcos being their customers. So we've seen the acquisition of a firm networks, Metaswitch by Azure. And I think that that, you know, there'll be a confluence of lots of different players here. But I think the signals we're getting from the hyperscalers are very clear. Yeah. The regional edge isn't far enough. They are moving aggressively further than that. So I think the next 3 years, watch what they're doing, and I think that will be a key driver of capital flows.
I have to add, we don't do anything to end market to consumers. So my big customers are the cloud platforms. So that when I say customers, I mean Azure, Microsoft, Google, others. So, but I agree with you, Chris.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. I know we've come up to time, and thanks so much, Joe, Eli, John, and Chris for being on the webinar. I know there were some technical issues, so sorry for those who couldn't hear us at the beginning. And yeah, we'll stay tuned for our next Edge webinar, hopefully in the near future. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for hosting.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.